Today we're opening a file from the Silent Archive. The subject, the Neurobiology of Transcendence. The premise is this. You have spent your entire life trapped inside a high-definition hallucination. It's time to move beyond the animal and into the architect. This is a clinical analysis.
That's a pretty provocative statement, right? But according to the archive, it's a clinically accurate one. This explainer is all about unpacking that hallucination, the one you call the self, and really understanding the biological mechanics that build it and keep it running.
You know, you probably think of your name, your personal history, that little voice in your head, as the absolute limits of who you are. But what this file suggests is that this entire identity is just a functional illusion. Think of it like a piece of biological software, an interface written for one single purpose: survival, not for finding truth.
Okay, so let's really get into this. How can the very thing we experience as us, our core identity, be considered a hallucination? Let's break it down.
This slide really lays it all out, the two sides of the coin. On the left, you've got your perceived reality, your name, your history, your inner thoughts. But on the right, that's the clinical reality. Your name, it's just a label for a biological construct. Your history, that's the data log for a temporary interface. And that constant inner monologue, it's a survival mechanism, endlessly running threat assessments.
So all those feelings of anxiety, that sense of smallness or limitation that you experience, they're not personal failings. They are the intended output of a system that's just operating as designed. It's hyper-focused on defining and protecting its own boundaries, almost obsessively. It's a feature, not a bug, of your survival interface.
And this brings us to a whole new way of defining transcendence. So forget the mysticism for a second. We are talking about a measurable, biological event. It's a technical process where the brain circuits that maintain the me program are temporarily shut down. And that allows for a direct experience of reality, the raw data of what is.
Okay, so how does this deactivation actually work? What's going on inside your head? Well, it really comes down to two key neural components that build your sense of self. First up, you've got the default mode network, or the DMN. This is basically your brain's hub for all self-centered thought, the autobiographical self. It's the part of you that's constantly replaying the past and worrying about the future. And for the vast majority of people, this network is hyperactive, creating what the archive calls a thick neural fog that completely obscures reality. The second piece of the puzzle is a specific part of your parietal lobe. Think of this as the hardware that generates your physical sense of self. It's constantly calculating where your body ends and where the rest of the universe begins. It is the literal architect of your physical boundaries.
Now, here's where it gets really interesting. During one of these transcendent experiences, activity in that default mode network drops. And I mean, it drops significantly. The constant self-obsessed story, that me narration, it just stops.
And at the exact same time, that key area in the parietal lobe, it powers down too. The brain can no longer compute the boundary between you and everything else. The distinction just ceases to exist.
And the result is this state of complete and total union. When the inner narrator goes silent and your physical boundaries dissolve, you don't just feel connected to the universe, your brain interprets you as the universe.
Now, it's absolutely critical to understand that this is not a loss of control. In fact, it's the ultimate expression of what you might call cognitive sovereignty. See, by deactivating the DMN, you stop the massive energy leak of the ego. Your prefrontal cortex is finally free to use all of its resources for pure observation, for creative synthesis, for accessing the raw data of existence. This is the neurobiological root of the flow state and mystical oneness.
But there is a major danger on this path, a very sophisticated deception that the source material calls metabolic mimicry. We need to examine this trap very, very closely.
And it all boils down to this one question you have to ask yourself. Is your spiritual practice actually leading to freedom, or is it just reinforcing the prison of the self with more elaborate spiritual-sounding bars?
This is the spiritual ego. It's what happens when the brain's DMN hijacks the language, the rituals, and the aesthetics of spirituality. But instead of dissolving the self, it uses all these tools to build a new and more enlightened version of it. You feel special, you feel awakened, superior. These are all hallmarks of a reinforced ego, not a transcended one.
And this slide, well, it makes the distinction brutally clear. True transcendence is a process of subtraction, of removing illusions. The spiritual ego is all about addition, adding new, virtuous labels to the self. One is about dissolving the I, the other is about creating a better, more awakened I.
One is pure experience, the other is the act of watching yourself perform spirituality.
So, how do we avoid this trap? How do we pursue genuine transcendence? Well, the archive provides a technical solution, the ego death protocol. The core principle here is a radical shift in your objective. We are not trying to improve the self or pamper it or care for it. The goal is to engineer its temporary dissolution so we can access a much higher level of cognitive function.
The protocol itself consists of 3 clear, actionable steps. Each one is specifically designed to systematically weaken the neural structures of the ego.
So here's the tactical breakdown. First, sensory deprivation. That means 30 minutes of absolute stillness every day. The goal isn't to meditate on some thought, it's to clinically ignore every single impulse from the DMN to start narrating. Second, identity liquidation. Once a week, do something where your name and your status are completely irrelevant. This starves the ego of its social fuel. And finally, the perspective shift. Regularly use memento mori. Zoom your consciousness out to a cosmic scale, where the me becomes just a mathematical rounding error. And this is the end state. By practicing this protocol, you don't destroy your personality. You gain mastery over it. You become the architect who can finally step outside the building of you and see reality without its distorting walls.
So we end with this final question from the archive. You possess a personality. It's an interface for navigating the world. But are you possessed by it? The difference is cognitive sovereignty. This concludes our analysis. End of file.
All right, let's get right into it. What if that whole path to enlightenment was actually leading you straight into a gilded cage? Today, we're pulling a file from the archive on a deception so sneaky, so subtle, it actually wears the mask of transcendence. We're talking about the spiritual ego. Okay, so the core idea from the archive is this. That voice in your head, the one you call you, it's not actually you. Think of it more like a survival program, a super high-def hallucination designed to help you navigate the world, but not to see it for what it really is. And you know that constant background noise? That feeling of being a little trapped, a little anxious? Well, that's just the program running, staring at its own walls. And this is exactly where the trap gets set. The whole process is so insidious because it takes the very tools of freedom and uses them to build a stronger prison. In the archive, we have a clinical term for this. We call it metabolic mimicry. So what is that exactly? Well, metabolic mimicry is when your brain hijacks the language of spirituality. You know, the words, the look, the rituals, but it's not using them to dissolve the ego. No, it's using them to supercharge it. It's basically the ego playing dress-up, learning all the spiritual lingo just to make itself feel even more important. And the crazy part is it feels like you're making progress, right? You're meditating, you're reading the ancient texts, you're talking about vibrations. But here's the acid test. If all those things are just making you feel more special, more awakened, or maybe just a little superior to everyone else, then you haven't escaped the cage. You've just redecorated it. So you've got these two paths that look similar but go in opposite directions. True transcendence? That's all about subtraction. It's a clinical, cold hard removal of illusions so you can see what is. But the spiritual ego? That's all about addition. It's about tacking on more and more spiritual virtues, creating this little spectator, this me that just sits back and watches itself be oh so spiritual. Now this is the real kicker. That spiritual high you get, that little buzz from feeling so awakened, neurologically speaking, it's a total counterfeit. It literally hijacks the exact same dopamine reward system as a regular old status high. Your brain can't tell the difference between you thinking you're enlightened and, say, getting a big promotion at work. Okay, so how does this trap actually get built inside your brain? Let's get clinical for a second and look at the neuroscience behind this whole deception. There are really two main players in your brain that construct this cage. First, you've got the default mode network, the DMN. This is your inner narrator, the part that's constantly spinning the story of me. It creates this thick neural fog of past regrets and future anxieties. Then there's the parietal lobe. Its job is to draw the physical line between you and not you. The spiritual ego just puts both of these systems into overdrive, constantly reinforcing those boundaries. And the data in the archive points to a pretty critical deadline here. By about age 45, if a person is still stuck in this trap, they often solidify into, well, what the texts call a curated fossil of their own vanity. I mean, think about that. They're so busy watching themselves be spiritual that any real connection is impossible. the whole system just gets locked in place. So we have to keep coming back to this because it's the most important takeaway. This whole journey isn't about self-improvement, it's about self-dissolution. It's that cold, hard, clinical realization that the you think you are, that story, is actually the biggest thing standing in the way of clarity. Which, of course, brings us to the prescription. How do you break out? Well, to achieve what the archive calls cognitive sovereignty, you have to shift from self-care to self-dissolution. And look, this isn't some fuzzy philosophy. This is a technical achievement, a kind of mental engineering. It's called the ego death protocol. It's a 3-step process, and it's designed to just systematically take apart the ego's defenses. It's all about engineering a new environment inside your own head. So let's break it down. Okay, step 1 is the sensory deprivation audit. We're talking 30 minutes of total, absolute stillness every day. But this isn't some passive, blissful meditation. No, your job here is to aggressively ignore every single story your default mode network tries to spin. A thought pops up, you witness it, and then you clinically refuse to own it. The goal here is to literally retrain your parietal lobe to stop building those walls. Next up, step 2. The identity liquidation exercise. Once a week, for just 1 hour, you operate in complete anonymity. What does that mean? It means you serve without recognition. You create something without putting your name on it. You move without looking in a mirror. You are deliberately starving the DMN of its social fuel, all that praise and recognition it feeds on. And finally, step 3 is the perspective shift. Now, this is a purely mental exercise. You're going to zoom your consciousness way, way out to the galactic scale. From the perspective of deep time and infinite space, this little story of me, it becomes a mathematical rounding error. It's nothing. And when the ego finally truly gets how insignificant it is, it just stops trying to run the show. So what's the end game here? What happens when you actually do this, when the ego is no longer in the driver's seat? You achieve a state the archive calls cognitive sovereignty. And the ultimate goal is pretty profound. By that critical age of 45, you should be able to step in and out of yourself whenever you want. You still have a personality, you still have a name, but you're not possessed by them anymore. The ego becomes a tool you can pick up when you need it and put down when you don't. Think of it like this. You've spent your whole life inside a building, thinking it was the entire universe. Now, you're the architect who has finally stepped outside. You can see the building for what it is, and for the first time, you can see the stars. So we'll leave you with this final question from the archive. See, true transcendence was never about finding yourself. It's about having the courage to lose yourself. So to really find the source, to connect with what's real, do you have the courage to witness your own disappearance?